There is a video that circulates periodically on football forums and social media accounts, and that every time it resurfaces produces the same reaction in the people who watch it for the first time. It is not a compilation of goals, it is not a collection of dribbles, it is a training session, a Barcelona training session from approximately 2000, and the person in the center of the frame is a boy of 16 or 17 who is doing things with a football that the other people in the frame, professional footballers, men who have dedicated their entire lives to the game, are watching with an expression that is difficult to categorize. It is not the expression of people watching a colleague. It is the expression of people watching something they cannot entirely explain. The boy is small. He is considerably smaller than everyone around him. He moves with a quality of stillness at the center of acceleration that the camera captures, but that no description quite conveys. He receives the ball. He goes past the first defender. He goes past the second. He goes past the third. He does not appear to be trying very hard. The boy is Lionel Andres Messi. He is from Rosario, Argentina, and he has been at the Barcelona Academy since he was 13 years old. And the growth hormone deficiency that brought him to Barcelona, that made it possible for a family of no resources to send their son to Spain because the club agreed to pay for his medical treatment in exchange for the exclusive right to his football development, has not yet been fully treated. He is still small. He will always be small relative to the game he plays. He will reach 5'7" in adulthood, which makes him shorter than the average male in the countries where the game he plays is most important. And he will, across the next 2 decades, become the most decorated footballer in the history of the sport. 8 Ballon d'Or awards. 7 to the nearest rival at the time of the most recent one. 4 FIFA World Player of the Year awards. 10 La Liga titles. 4 UEFA Champions League trophies. The FIFA World Cup with Argentina in 2002 too. A career statistical record that in virtually every relevant category exceeds anything the history of professional football had previously produced. And yet, despite all of that, despite the numbers and the trophies and the universal critical consensus that places him at or near the summit of everything the game has ever produced, there is something about his story that the standard account does not capture. Something that the official narrative of the genius from Rosario who came to Barcelona and became the greatest footballer of all time leaves out. Not about his football, about him, about the specific cost of what he built and the specific nature of what he had to overcome to build it, and the specific quality of the internal life that the external record of goals and trophies and awards and records does not begin to describe. About the boy who was sent to another continent at 13 and who was told implicitly and explicitly and in ways that the institution that sent him there did not intend as cruelty, but that a 13-year-old from Rosario experienced as exactly that. That the price of the medical treatment and the development and the future he was being offered was the complete subordination of everything he was to everything the club needed him to become. This documentary is about that story, the story that the goals do not tell, the story of what it actually cost to be Lionel Messi, and what it revealed about the specific mechanisms of professional football at its highest level, and what happened to a boy from a working class family in Rosario when the game decided he was the most valuable piece of human athletic potential it had ever identified and organized itself with the comprehensive efficiency that professional sport applies to valuable things around the project of extracting that potential. The story of the anxiety, the story of the retirement announcements and the returns and the contract that wasn't renewed and the tax prosecution and the night in Russia and the years when the country he played for couldn't understand why he wasn't saving them, and the story of what happened in Qatar in 2022 when all of it, all 20 years of it, arrived at something that the game and the man himself had spent 2 decades waiting for. That is the story this documentary is going to tell. and it is the most interesting story in the history of the sport. If this is the kind of story you come here for, the real story, underneath the statistics and the highlights, subscribe. Every week we go to the place behind the legend. This is one of the most extraordinary places we have ever been. Lionel Andres Messi was born on June 24th, 1987 in Rosario, Argentina, the third of 4 children born to Jorge Messi and Celia Cucatini. His father worked in a steel factory. His mother worked part-time as a cleaner. The family lived in the Las Heras neighborhood of Rosario, which was not the wealthiest part of a city that was not among the wealthiest in Argentina. The specific quality of the Messi family's circumstances, not destitute, but without the kind of financial buffer that protects a family from the consequences of unexpected events, is the material context without which the decision they eventually made about their son cannot be fully understood. He began playing football almost before he began walking, in the way that children in Argentina's football culture begin, in the streets with cousins and friends, with the ball as the organizing principle of daily existence rather than a recreational option among many. His grandmother, Celia, after whom his daughter would later be named, was the person who first recognized what he was and who took him to the local club, Grandoli, at the age of 4. He was, by the accounts of everyone who saw him in those years, immediately and unmistakably different from the other children. Not just better, different. The quality of his relationship with the ball, the specific way he processed the space around him, the combination of balance and vision, and the particular quality of his touch that would later make the world stop and watch, were present from childhood in a form that the coaches who worked with him at Grandoli and then at Newell's Old Boys describe as something they had not seen before and have not seen since. The growth hormone deficiency was diagnosed when he was 10 years old. He was producing insufficient levels of human growth hormone, which meant that without treatment he would not grow to a normal adult height. The treatment, daily injections of synthetic growth hormone administered by his family, cost approximately $900 a month in the early 2000s. His father's salary at the steel factory did not make $900 a month available for medical treatment. The family explored options. His father's employer would pay for the treatment for 1 year. The Argentine Football Association, which was approached with a specific proposal that this boy was worth investing in, declined. River Plate, one of Argentina's most prestigious clubs, expressed interest but could not commit to funding the treatment. The family was in the specific situation that families without resources face when their child requires expensive ongoing medical care, running out of options. The Barcelona connection came through his father's cousin, who had contacts in the city, and through the specific network of scouts and intermediaries that European clubs were deploying in South America in the early 2000s as the movement of young talent across the Atlantic accelerated. Carles Rexach, the Barcelona sporting director, was presented with a video of the 12-year-old Messi playing in Rosario. He watched it. He flew to Argentina to see the boy in person. What he saw convinced him that Barcelona was looking at something unprecedented, and that the specific cost of bringing that something to Catalonia, the medical treatment, the family relocation, the institutional investment in a child who was not yet a teenager, was a cost the club should pay. The agreement, according to the legend that has been repeated many times, was written on a paper napkin at a restaurant meeting, because formal contracts were not immediately available. The napkin story may be embellished. The agreement was real. Barcelona would pay for Messi's treatment. In exchange, Messi would come to Barcelona. He was 13 years old when he arrived. His father came with him initially. His mother and his siblings remained in Rosario. The family was eventually reunited in Barcelona, but the initial period The period of adjustment and homesickness, and the specific experience of being a child from a working class neighborhood in Argentina, trying to find his place in a football academy that was, by the standards of European youth development, the most rigorous and most demanding environment in the world, was not by any account that people close to him have given an easy one. He was small, he was quiet, he spoke little by the accounts of his La Masia teammates, and the little he spoke was in an Argentine Spanish accent that marked him immediately as someone from elsewhere. He was talented beyond anything the academy had seen. He was also a 13-year-old who was homesick and uncertain, and in a country whose culture was not his own. The La Masia Academy, where he lived and trained from 2000 to his first team promotion, was an institution designed to produce Barcelona footballers, not simply technically accomplished players. Barcelona footballers formed in the specific philosophy of play that Johan Cruyff had implanted in the club's DNA, and that the academy was the vehicle for transmitting across generations. The football that La Masia taught was the football of positional play and pressing, and the specific quality of spatial intelligence that the Barcelona first team demonstrated at its best. And that required a formation that began by the academy's design in childhood. Messi absorbed it. He absorbed it in the way that someone who is already doing instinctively what the philosophy was trying to teach absorbs a formal statement of the principle with recognition rather than learning. He was already, before anyone had given it a name, playing the football that La Masia was trying to produce. The story of how a 13-year-old from Rosario became the most important player in the history of the most important club in the world is not the story most people know. Subscribe if you're not already here. What comes next is the chapter that explains everything the highlights don't show. He made his competitive debut for Barcelona's first team on October 16th, 2004, at the age of 17. He came on as a substitute in a La Liga match against Espanyol. He was on the pitch for less than a minute before he was substituted off again after a foul that the referee adjudged worthy of a yellow card applied to whoever had fouled him. The yellow card was given to Messi by mistake. The referee apparently confused which player had committed the foul in the chaos of the moment. It is the kind of absurd administrative error that the very beginning of great careers sometimes contains, as if the story is establishing from its first moment that the path to what follows will not be without its complications. He became a regular first-team presence across the 2005-2006 season and the seasons that followed, in a trajectory of development that was rapid by any standard, and that was in the specific context of Barcelona's squad depth during those years, dependent on the specific moments of opportunity that the coaching staff and the club's management provided or failed to provide. Frank Rijkaard, who managed Barcelona during Messi's first years in the first team, has spoken about the specific challenge of managing the development of a player of Messi's quality within a squad that already contained Ronaldinho and Deco and Samuel Eto'o and the other figures who made Barcelona the most exciting club in European football in the mid-2000s. The challenge was not technical, it was the management of ego and hierarchy and the specific social dynamics of a dressing room containing some of the most prominent players in the world, into which a teenager of exceptional talent was being introduced. He became a regular first-team presence across the 2005-2006 season and the seasons that followed, in a trajectory of development that was rapid by any standard, and that was, in the specific context of Barcelona's squad depth during those years, dependent on the specific moments of opportunity that the coaching staff and the club's management provided or failed to provide. Frank Rijkaard, who managed Barcelona during Messi's first years in the first team, has spoken about the specific challenge of managing the development of a player of Messi's quality within a squad that already contained Ronaldinho and Deco and Samuel Eto'o and the other figures who made Barcelona the most exciting club in European football in the mid-2000s. The challenge was not technical. It was the management of ego and hierarchy and the specific social dynamics of a dressing room containing some of the most prominent players in the world, into which a teenager of exceptional talent was being introduced. Pep Guardiola became Barcelona's manager in the summer of 2008. The subsequent 4 seasons from 2008-09 to 2001-12 are the period that most football historians identify as the peak of club football in the modern era, and the period during which the specific question of what Messi was capable of received its most complete answer. Guardiola had been at Barcelona since the beginning of his career, had played in the Cruyff teams of the early 90s, and understood the club's philosophy at the deepest level available. He also understood from his first weeks as manager that the specific asset Messi represented required a tactical deployment that the previous regime had not fully identified. He moved Messi from the right wing into a central role, a position that was not quite that of a traditional number 9, but that occupied the spaces in and around the centre forward position in ways that the defensive organisations of opposing teams were structurally incapable of dealing with. The 2008-09 season produced the first treble in Barcelona's history. The Champions League final, played in Rome against Manchester United, was won 2-0, with Messi scoring the second goal, a header which surprised everyone who had followed his career and who associated his excellence exclusively with his feet. Guardiola had spent weeks in training working on Messi's movement from deep positions to arrive in the penalty area at the right time for crosses from the left. The header was the product of that work. It was also, in its way, the product of the same quality that made everything he did possible, the willingness to add to what he already was, rather than to rely on what he already was. The debate about whether Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo was the better player dominated the football conversation for the better part of a decade, from 2008 to 2018. And it is a debate that this documentary is not going to resolve, because the question it poses is not a question that evidence can answer in the way that evidence answers other questions. What the debate did, and what it produced for Messi specifically, was a competitive environment of extraordinary intensity, a bilateral rivalry conducted in full public view, measured by Ballon d'Or awards and Champions League trophies and league titles and goal tallies, in which the two best players of their generation pushed each other across a decade of parallel excellence to heights that neither would have reached without the pressure of the other's presence. The specific dynamic between them, the two players of genuinely different styles and genuinely different personalities competing for the same recognition in the same period, was, for the football audience that followed it, one of the most compelling long-form competitive narratives the sport had produced. For Messi, it was something additional. It was the specific external pressure of a comparison that was always available and always in use, layered on top of the internal pressure that the Argentina question and the anxiety and the specific expectations of the Barcelona institution already provided. He won the Ballon d'Or in 2009, he won it in 2010, he won it in 2011, he won it in 2012, Ronaldo won it in 2013 and 2014, he won it in 2015, Ronaldo won it in 2016, 2017 and 2019. He won it in 2019 and 2023. The sequence is the record of a decade and a half of football at a level that the history of the game had not previously produced from two players simultaneously, and that the history of the game may not produce simultaneously again. The rivalry did not produce a friendship by the accounts of people close to both players. but it produced a mutual respect that both have expressed in various forms and at various points with what appears to be genuine rather than diplomatic sincerity. They made each other better. The making was not always comfortable. The evidence that it was real is in the numbers. The anxiety disorder that has been discussed in public with varying degrees of candor across the years of his career is the dimension of his story that the official account has most consistently minimized, and that the people who have observed him most closely, most consistently, return to as the key to understanding the full picture. He vomited on the pitch, not once, repeatedly, across the early years of his career, in matches where the pressure was at its highest and the specific combination of physical intensity and psychological load that elite football produces reached a level that his body expressed in the only way it could. The vomiting was reported as a medical issue, as a dietary problem, as something that would be addressed and resolved. It was addressed eventually with specific psychological support and with the specific management of his preparation and his routine that the Barcelona medical and psychological staff developed around his needs. It was not simply resolved, it was managed. And the management of it, the specific ongoing work of containing an anxiety response in someone whose entire professional life was conducted in conditions of extreme public pressure, is part of the story of what it cost to perform at the level he performed at. The Argentina dimension of his story is the dimension that generated, for the longest period and with the greatest intensity, the specific form of public pressure that his anxiety was most required to manage. He made his senior international debut for Argentina in August 2005 at the age of 18. He was sent off after 63 seconds for a foul on a Hungarian defender, an event whose absurdity echoed the yellow card at his Barcelona debut, as if the international stage was establishing, from its first contact with him, a quality of resistance that the domestic stage had not quite produced. He played on. He became, as his Barcelona career took the shape that the history of the game was going to record, the central figure around whom Argentina's World Cup hopes organized themselves. And he failed, not in the statistical sense. His numbers in World Cup tournaments were consistently good. His individual performances across multiple tournaments contained moments of genuine brilliance. He failed in the sense that the tournament did not produce the result that the country demanded and that his presence in the team was used to promise. Germany 2006 was a quarter-final exit. South Africa 2010 was a quarter-final exit against Germany in a match that his team lost 4-0 in a way that suggested the gap between Argentina and the top European sides was wider than his presence in the squad had allowed the country to believe. Brazil 2014 was the final, a final that Argentina lost in extra time to Germany, that Messi played through with a physical condition that was later revealed to have been compromised. That he left without a medal and with his individual award for the tournament's best player sitting in his hands as a kind of consolation prize, that the press and the public and a significant portion of the country treated as an insult. The Copa America finals were worse in their accumulation. 2007 in Venezuela, lost to Brazil. 2015 in Chile, lost to Chile on penalties, with Messi missing his penalty in the shootout. 2016 in the United States, the centenary Copa America, lost to Chile on penalties again, with Messi missing his penalty in the shootout again. After the 2016 final, he sat on the pitch for a long time before walking to the podium. He received his runner-up medal. He took it off almost immediately. He walked to the microphone and announced his retirement from international football. He was 28 years old. He said that it was the best decision for himself and for everyone. He said he had tried many times and it hadn't worked out and he didn't want to keep suffering. The retirement lasted 3 months. He came back. He was asked in subsequent interviews why he came back. His answers varied in their specificity, but converged on the same thing. He could not leave the national team without the title. Not because of the record, not because of what history would say, because of something that the record and the history and the external assessment of his career did not touch, because of what it meant to him, personally and specifically, as a man from Rosario who had left Argentina at 13 and who had spent 20 years playing for a country that had given him the largest part of his identity, even as it had sometimes seemed uncertain whether it entirely accepted him. The retirement announcement was real. So was the thing that made it impossible to sustain. What I am going to tell you now is the part of this story that the football press has reported and that the people who follow his career know the outline of, but that nobody has assembled with the honesty it requires. It is the part about what happens to a person who is the best in the world at something and who, despite being the best in the world at it, is told repeatedly by the country that should be the source of his deepest pride that the best is not enough. That all of it, all the Ballons d'Or, all the Champions Leagues, all the records does not count because the one thing that the country values above everything else is the thing he has not yet provided. I want to show you what that does to a person, and then I want to show you what it means that in the end he provided it anyway. The Barcelona years were, for a significant portion of their duration, the most sustained exhibition of individual footballing excellence that the game had produced. The 211-1-2 season, in which he scored 73 goals in all competitions for Barcelona, a record that the sport had never previously approached and that the sport has not surpassed since, is the statistical peak of a career that contains so many statistical peaks that identifying any single one as most remarkable is itself a kind of inadequacy. The 2009-10 treble under Pep Guardiola, the 5-0 against Real Madrid in November 2010, in which he was involved in 4 of the 5 goals and played with a quality that the Spanish press described with the specific superlative vocabulary that Spanish football journalism deploys, and that had never quite found a subject adequate to it until this match, as something beyond football. The 2015 Champions League final, his last, in which he scored and assisted in a 3-1 victory over Juventus, and in which the quality of his movement and his decision-making was the most complete expression of what the Guardiola-era Barcelona had been trying to build. The tax fraud case that the Spanish authorities brought against Messi and his father, Jorge, in 2013, and that resulted in a conviction in 2016, a 21-month suspended sentence, and a fine of €2 million, is the chapter of his Barcelona years that the official account most assiduously manages. The case involved the use of shell companies in Uruguay and Belize and Switzerland to conceal image rights income from the Spanish tax authorities between 2007 and 2009. The amounts involved were approximately €4.5 million. The defense was that Jorge Messi, who managed his son's commercial affairs, was responsible for the arrangements, and that Lionel had simply signed what his father put in front of him without understanding its implications. The court found both men guilty. The conviction was upheld on appeal. The case produced a specific and complicated response from the public and from the Spanish press, partly because the tax arrangements that the prosecution described were not unique to the Messi family. Numerous other prominent figures in Spanish public life, including many other professional footballers, had been investigated for similar arrangements. And partly because the specific defense that a man of Messi's intelligence and commercial significance had signed documents he did not understand was one that his defenders found difficult to make credibly and that his critics used with precision. He was not, by any serious assessment of the evidence, a passive bystander in the commercial management of his own career. He was an attentive and intelligent participant in his own affairs. The question of what he knew and when he knew it is one that the court assessed and that the public has continued to debate, with conclusions that vary depending on the degree of generosity the assessor brings to the specific question of what a 20-year-old football prodigy, operating in a culture where tax optimization was routine and where the boundary between optimization and evasion was not always clearly maintained, can reasonably be expected to have understood about the specific legal character of his father's commercial arrangements. The end of his time at Barcelona was not the end he or anyone who had watched his career had imagined. The club's financial situation, the specific combination of the pandemic's impact on match day and commercial revenues, the accumulated debt from years of transfer spending at levels the club's income could not sustainably support, and the specific requirements of the Spanish Football League's financial fair play regulations made it impossible, in the summer of 2021, to register the contract that the club had negotiated with him and that he had signed. The announcement was made on August 5th, 2021. Messi gave a press conference in which he cried. The images of him crying at the press conference were received by the football world with the specific mixture of shock and grief that the departure of a figure who had seemed genuinely permanent produces. He had been at Barcelona for 21 years. He had arrived at 13. He had played his entire professional career, all 16 professional seasons to that point, in the blue and red shirt. The departure was not a transfer in the ordinary sense of the word, it was an amputation. Paris Saint-Germain signed him within days. The PSG years were, by almost every assessment of people who follow them closely, a period of genuine difficulty. Not because he was not good, he was still, even at 34 and 35, producing moments that no other player on the planet could produce, but because the specific relationship between Messi and Paris, between a man whose entire professional identity had been formed in Barcelona and the city and the club and the culture that were trying to adopt him, did not produce the warmth or the success that the commercial logic of the signing had suggested it might. He was booed by PSG supporters. The booing was in the specific context of a fan base that had expected the arrival of Messi to produce Champions League success, and that watched instead as the team was eliminated from the competition in the round of 16 in both. His seasons at the club, a response to disappointment rather than to the man himself. But it was directed at him. He was booed in the city where he played for his club, in the stadium where his club played its home matches. It was a thing that had not happened to him before in his professional career. I want to stop here and say something directly. What happened to Messi between the summer of 2000 and 2002, between a press conference at Barcelona where he cried and a night in Lusail, Qatar, where he lifted the World Cup, is one of the most compressed and most consequential 18-month periods in the history of any individual sporting career. It contains the departure and the booing and the worst professional period of his adult life, and then the thing that made all of it make sense in retrospect. I am going to take you through every piece of it, and by the time we are done, the World Cup final in Qatar will not simply be the greatest match in the history of the tournament. It will be the end of a story that started in the steelworkers' house in Rosario more than 30 years ago. Stay with me. Argentina arrived at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar having not lost a match in 36 games. The run had begun in July 2021 when Argentina won the Copa America, the tournament that had broken him in 2015 and in 2016, and that he had retired from international football over and then come back from because the retirement was not something he could sustain. The Copa America victory had been his first senior international trophy with Argentina. He was 33 years old when he won it. He had been trying to win it for 17 years. The specific quality of his reaction when the final whistle blew in the Maracanã in Rio de Janeiro, the way he stood on the pitch for a moment, not running, not celebrating in the exuberant way that players who have just won something run and celebrate, but standing as if the specific weight of the previous 17 years needed a moment to shift before the celebration could begin, was one of the most photographed images of that summer and one of the most accurately expressive photographs of his entire career. The Copa America had resolved one question. The World Cup was the other one, the larger one, the one that Argentina and the football world and he himself had been asking for 2 decades. Maradona had won it. Maradona's shadow, the specific shadow of a man who had carried a mediocre Argentine side to the World Cup almost single-handedly in 1986, and who was, in the specific mythology of Argentine football, the standard against which every subsequent Argentine player was measured, had been present over Messi's international career from the beginning. The comparison was unfair in the way that comparisons between different players in different eras are always unfair. It was also, in the specific cultural context of Argentine football, inescapable. He was Messi. Maradona had won the World Cup. Until Messi won the World Cup, the comparison would always be used to diminish him. The group stage of the 2022 World Cup began with what was, at the time, the most shocking result of the tournament's opening days. Argentina, who were regarded as genuine contenders and who had arrived in Qatar on the back of the 36-match unbeaten run, lost their first match to Saudi Arabia 2-1. The Saudi goals came from a late surge in the second half, from a team whose performance was one of the most extraordinary upsets in recent World Cup history, in conditions that the Argentine players described after the match as resembling a nightmare. Messi was on the pitch for all 90 minutes. He did not play badly. The team played badly collectively. The result produced in Argentina and in the global football conversation about the tournament an immediate and intense recalibration of expectation. The unbeaten run was over. The team that had arrived as contenders had lost to Saudi Arabia. The World Cup was again not going to plan. What happened in the following 5 weeks is the chapter of his career that every serious examination of his story must spend the most time on, because it is the chapter that makes the most sense of everything that preceded it. He played every minute of every match. He scored in the round of 16 against Australia, a goal that required him to receive the ball with his back to goal, turn his marker, and finish with the specific combination of body shape and touch that only he produces. He scored against the Netherlands in the quarterfinal. A goal from the penalty spot after a match of extraordinary intensity that went to extra time and then to a penalty shootout that Argentina won in circumstances of high drama. He played the entire semi-final against Croatia. He scored twice. He assisted the third. The performance was, by the consensus of the people who analyse football most carefully, one of the best individual performances in World Cup semi-final history. The final against France on December 18th, 2022, in the Lusail iconic stadium, is the match that the football world has already concluded was the greatest World Cup final ever played and possibly the greatest single match in the tournament's 92-year history. Argentina led 2-0 with 12 minutes to play. France scored twice in quick succession to make it 2-2 and take the match to extra time. In extra time, Messi scored. Argentina led 3-2. France scored again. 3-3. Penalties. The shootout that decided it. that produced Argentina's victory and Messi's World Cup, 36 years after Maradona's. In front of a global television audience of approximately 1.5 billion people, was conducted with the specific weight of everything the previous 2 decades had accumulated pressing down on it. He took the first Argentine penalty he scored. He did not celebrate in a way that suggested he had resolved anything. He ran back to the center circle with an expression that the cameras captured and that the people who have spent years watching him recognize as the expression of someone for whom the stakes are too high for ordinary celebration, and who will not celebrate until he knows it is safe to celebrate. The specific texture of the match, the 90 minutes, the extra time, the penalties, is worth describing more carefully than the summary of the result allows. Because the texture is where the story of those 5 weeks in Qatar arrives at its most concentrated expression. He played all 120 minutes he had already played to that point in the tournament, more than 600 minutes of football across 6 matches in the space of 5 weeks, at 35 years old, in a tournament played in intense conditions against opponents who had prepared specifically to stop him. He was not physically fresh. Nobody in that final was physically fresh. The match was, by the accounts of the players who played in it, the most demanding individual experience any of them had had in their careers. His goal in extra time, his second of the match, his 7th of the tournament, was characteristic in the way that his most important goals are characteristic. Not the most spectacular thing he had done, technically, but the most important. He received the ball in the scramble in the penalty area, in a position that required him to assess 3 different defenders and 2 possible angles of shot in less time than it takes to describe the assessment, and he produced the finish that the assessment required. Low, accurate, through the gap that was briefly available and that his specific reading of the situation had identified before it was open. It was the goal of someone who had played so many big moments that the specificity of the moment, the World Cup final, the 35 years, the entire weight of the Argentina question did not enter the calculation. The calculation was football. He made it correctly. Argentina won. He lifted the trophy. The image of Messi holding the World Cup in the specific light of the Lusail Stadium, in the Argentine shirt, with the bisht draped over his shoulders by the Emir of Qatar in a gesture of honor, whose specific significance was debated at length, but whose visual effect was to frame the moment in something ancient and ceremonial, became within hours one of the most widely shared photographs in the history of social media. Not because of what it was technically, though the photograph is technically excellent, because of what it meant, because every person who looked at it knew the story of everything that had preceded it and understood, with the specific emotional clarity that sporting redemption produces in people who have followed the story long enough to carry it, that the story had arrived at its resolution. He was awarded the Golden Ball as the tournament's best player. It was his second. He had won it in 2014 in the final that Argentina lost. This one felt different. He stood on the podium with the trophy and the medal and the bisht, and the face that was not yet fully able to process what had happened, and the football world watched and tried to process it along with him. The thing that the statistical record of his career cannot contain, and that the coverage of the Qatar triumph tended to reduce to a single image rather than examine with the depth it merits, is the specific human architecture that the career was built on. Antonella Roccuzzo, who is now his wife, grew up in the same neighborhood in Rosario. She is the cousin of his childhood best friend Lucas Scalia. He knew her from childhood. He left for Barcelona at 13, and they maintained the connection across the distance, the specific connection that people who grew up in the same place maintain across the distances that their respective careers or circumstances impose. A connection that was not romantic in its early years, but that had underneath whatever it was at any given moment, the specific quality of being rooted in the same soil. They married in 2017 in Rosario in a ceremony that the Argentine press described as the wedding of the century, and that was in its specific human texture. Two people from Las Heras going home to be married in the city they came from, regardless of everything that had happened to them in the intervening decades. His three sons, Tiago, born in 2012, Matteo, born in 2015, and Ciro, born in 2018, have been a visible presence in his public life in a way that is unusual for a figure of his level of global fame. He has spoken about them in interviews with a specificity and a warmth that the people who cover him describe as the most unguarded version of himself that the public has access to. He coaches them by accounts of people who have seen them together with the specific patience and the specific directness that the best coaching requires, and that the specific combination of being a father and being the person you are makes complicated in ways that are genuinely interesting. Tiago, the oldest, was photographed in the stands in Qatar across every match of the tournament, wearing his father's shirt. The photograph of Tiago's face in the moments after the final whistle, the specific expression of a 15-year-old who had grown up understanding better than most 15-year-olds understand anything what the previous 17 years had been about, was, by the accounts of people who saw it, one of the most emotionally precise images of the entire tournament. The coaching staff of the Argentine national team under Lionel Scaloni, who was appointed head coach in 2018 after the disastrous World Cup in Russia, and who built, across the subsequent 4 years, the specific collective identity that the Qatar squad expressed, created conditions around Messi that the previous regimes had not managed to create. Not by diminishing the importance of his individual contribution, which remained the central element of Argentina's game plan, but by building around it a team of genuine collective quality whose defensive organization and whose tactical intelligence gave him the freedom to express himself without the sense that any individual failure was his individual responsibility to compensate for. The specific team spirit of the Qatar squad, the specific relationship between Messi and players like Rodrigo de Paul and Julian Alvarez and Alexis McAllister, players a decade younger than him who had grown up watching him and who played in Qatar with both the specific competence of people at the peak of their powers and the specific emotional investment of people who understood what they were part of, was qualitatively different from the team spirit that had characterized previous Argentine World Cup squads. He was not carrying the team. He was part of the team that was carrying itself. The distinction made everything possible. He joined Inter Miami in the summer of 2023. The decision to come to Major League Soccer rather than to return to Barcelona, which had publicly expressed interest in his return, or to accept the offers from Saudi Arabia that were reportedly among the most financially significant in the history of professional sport, was received with a mixture of surprise and respect that reflected the specific quality of his decision-making across the final phase of his career. He chose Miami. He chose a league that was not among the best in the world. He chose a city that was warm and that his family had already established a connection to, and that offered him, at 35, the specific combination of quality of life and continued professional engagement that the previous 2 years in Paris had demonstrated he needed to find somewhere. The reception in Miami was, by every account of people who witnessed the opening weeks of his time at the club, extraordinary in a way that exceeded what even the most optimistic projections had suggested. The effect of his presence on the league's profile was immediate and measurable. Broadcast audiences, social media engagement, the commercial value of Inter Miami as a brand, all increased at rates that the league had not previously experienced. He scored on his debut in the Leagues Cup a free kick in the 94th minute to win the match. The goal produced scenes at the stadium that the American sports media, which had been paying attention to football with increasing seriousness for several years, described as unlike anything they had witnessed at a domestic football match. He went on to win the Leagues Cup with Inter Miami. He won the Ballon d'Or for the 8th time in October 2023. The Inter Miami chapter is not simply an epilogue. It is a deliberate final act chosen by someone who understood after the World Cup that the remaining years of his career belonged to him rather than to any institutional demand. He had given the institutional demands everything they required. Barcelona had his 21 years and his 7 Ballons d'Or and his 4 Champions Leagues and his 10 La Liga titles. Argentina had his World Cup and his Copa America and the 36-match unbeaten run and the years of final losses and retirement announcements and returns that led to them. What he kept for himself for the last chapter in the warm city in Florida, where the pressure was different and the expectations were set at a human rather than a mythological level, was the joy of playing. The joy is visible. It was visible in the Copa America 2024, which he won with Argentina in the United States, extending the unbeaten run and confirming the post-Qatar era of Argentine football as something that had not dissipated with the World Cup victory, but had been transformed by it. It was visible in the training sessions that the Inter Miami supporters who watch the open practices have described with a consistency that suggests they are reporting something real. The expression of someone who is still at 37 doing the thing that the training video from 2004 showed a 16-year-old boy doing in the Barcelona training ground. The thing that made the professional footballers around him watch with an expression that was difficult to categorize. The still center inside the acceleration. The quality of his relationship with the ball that no amount of time or distance from Rosario has altered. What really happened to Messi is something simpler and something more complicated than the official account has been able to say. What happened is that a boy of 13 was identified as the most valuable piece of human athletic potential the game had seen, was transported to another continent and given a medical treatment and a football education and a career that the world has assessed as the greatest individual career the game has produced. What happened is that the same boy was asked implicitly and explicitly, and in ways that the game did not understand as demanding, but that he experienced as demands, to carry not just his own ambitions, but the ambitions of a country and an institution and a global audience of hundreds of millions of people who had organized a portion of their emotional lives around his football. What happened is that he carried it, all of it, for 2 decades without the protection that the carrying required, through the anxiety and the vomiting and the retirement announcements and the tax case and the booing in Paris and the lost finals and the Saudi Arabia shock in the group stage. He carried it until Qatar. And in Qatar, across 5 weeks in the desert, he set it down. Lionel Andres Messi, born June 24th, 1987 in Rosario, Argentina. The son of a steel worker and a cleaner, the boy with the growth hormone deficiency, whose treatment cost more than his father earned. The 13-year-old who arrived in Barcelona with a suitcase and a contract written on a napkin and a talent that the people who saw it did not have the vocabulary for. The player who scored 91 goals in a calendar year, who won 8 Ballons d'Or, who won the World Cup at 35 with the country that sent him to another continent at 13 and asked him for 20 years to give back what he owed. Who played his last professional years in Miami in the warmth, with his family, doing the thing that he had been doing since before he could articulate why he did it, which is the thing that the training video shows, and that 2 decades of professional football at the highest level could not change. The small, still boy at the center of the acceleration, going past the defender, going past the next one, doing it without appearing to try very hard. The greatest of all time, not because of the 8 Ballons d'Or, because of what it cost to earn them, and because of what he was willing to pay, and because of what it means that the payment was made in full, and that the receipt, when it finally arrived in Qatar in December 2022, looked exactly like what he had been waiting 35 years for it to look like. The Maradona comparison, the comparison that haunted his international career for 2 decades, and that the Qatar victory did not so much resolve as transcend, is worth examining one final time with the honesty it requires. Diego Maradona was, in the specific conditions of Argentine football and Argentine national identity in 1986, a figure of extraordinary cultural weight. He won the World Cup in Mexico with a team that was not, by the objective measure of its individual talent, the best team at the tournament, and he won it in a way that required him to be, in the most consequential matches, both the team's best player and its most important creative force and its most resilient psychological anchor simultaneously. He won it with his hand and with his feet, and with the specific combination of genius and cunning that the Argentine footballing tradition honors as the truest expression of the game's possibilities. He was, at his best, the closest thing to pure football genius that any human being had produced to that point. Messi won the World Cup in 2022 with a team that was better than Maradona's, deeper, more tactically coherent, built around collective quality rather than individual transcendence. He won it in a final that was, in its specific drama and its specific quality of play and its specific emotional weight, a match that Maradona's 1986 did not quite equal. He won it at 35 after 17 years of failing to win it, and one retirement announcement, and the press conference where he cried, and the booing in Paris, and the tournament opening loss to Saudi Arabia. He won it in a way that required everything he had rather than simply the best of what he had. And he won it in a way that made the Maradona comparison not a diminishment of either man, but a recognition that the game had been fortunate enough to produce, in 2 generations separated by a quarter century, 2 people who expressed its highest possibilities in ways that were genuinely different and genuinely equal and genuinely irreplaceable. The Copa America 2024 final, played at the Hard Rock Stadium in Miami, the city where he now lived, the city whose club he now played for, produced another injury, another moment of the body enforcing its limits against a will that refused to acknowledge them. He left the pitch with a muscle injury, watched Argentina win on penalties from the bench, and then walked back onto the pitch limping to collect the trophy. The limp was visible in every photograph. So was the face of someone who had limped to enough trophies to know that the limp was irrelevant and that the trophy was everything, and who had also, by that point, been given enough trophies to know that the trophy was not quite everything either, that what mattered was the thing underneath the trophy. The thing that had been there in the training ground in 2004 when the professional footballers watched him with the expression that was difficult to categorize, the still center, the boy from Rosario, still there, thank you for staying until the end. This is the celebrity code, and the code, once you see it, cannot be unseen